The gunshot that rang out across the frozen valley was the last sound Eleanor Webb expected to hear before her horse stumbled and threw her headlong into a snowbank that swallowed her whole. She clawed her way to the surface, gasping for air, her lungs burning from the icy Colorado wind that tore across the mountain pass. The year was 1882, and Eleanor had been riding from Denver to reach her sister in the mining town of Leadville before the worst of the winter storms hit. She had miscalculated. The blizzard had descended upon her with a fury that turned the world into a white hell, and now her horse was gone, spooked by the gunfire, and vanished into the swirling snow. Eleanor's fingers were already going numb inside her leather gloves as she tried to get her bearings. The temperature had dropped so quickly that her breath froze on her scarf, and visibility was reduced to mere feet in front of her face. Another gunshot cracked through the air, closer this time, and Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. She was 22 years old, unmarried, and had promised her ailing sister that she would be there before Christmas. That promise now seemed like a foolish dream as she struggled to stand in snow that reached past her knees. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and Eleanor knew with terrible certainty that if she did not find shelter soon, she would freeze to death out here in this God-forsaken wilderness. A dark shape materialized through the white curtain of snow, and Eleanor's hand went instinctively to the small pistol she kept in her coat pocket. The shape resolved itself into a man on horseback, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath a snow-crusted hat and a bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth. He reined in his horse beside her, and Eleanor could see his eyes, a startling blue-green even in the dim light of the storm, assessing her with a mixture of surprise and concern. "You hurt?" His voice was rough, muffled by the bandana, but there was genuine worry in it. Eleanor shook her head, not trusting her voice. Her teeth were chattering so hard she was afraid she might bite her tongue if she tried to speak. The cowboy swung down from his horse with practiced ease and grabbed her arm to steady her as she swayed on her feet. "Where is your horse?" "Gone," Eleanor managed to force out. The shot spooked her. The cowboy cursed under his breath, a colorful string of words that would have made Eleanor's mother faint. "Those were mine. I was trying to signal through the storm. There is a line shack about half a mile from here, but we need to move now. This storm is only getting worse." Eleanor nodded, grateful beyond words. The cowboy pulled her up behind him on his horse, a sturdy bay gelding that seemed unfazed by the additional weight. Eleanor wrapped her arms around the stranger's waist, too cold and too desperate to care about propriety. She could feel the solid warmth of him even through their layers of clothing, and she pressed closer, seeking any heat she could find. The ride to the line shack was a nightmare of white confusion. Eleanor could not see anything beyond the cowboy's broad back, and she simply held on and trusted that he knew where he was going. The wind tore at them with savage intensity, and several times Eleanor was certain they would be blown right off the horse, but the cowboy rode with the confidence of a man who had spent his entire life in the saddle, and eventually a dark shape loomed out of the snow ahead of them. The line shack was small, barely more than a rough cabin with a single room, but to Eleanor it looked like a palace. The cowboy dismounted and pulled her down after him, then led his horse around to the lean-to shelter attached to the side of the shack. Eleanor stumbled to the door and tried the handle with numb fingers. It was unlocked, thank God, and she pushed it open and fell inside. The interior was dark and cold, but at least it was out of the wind. Eleanor could hear the cowboy outside tending to his horse, and she forced herself to move, to do something useful. There was a small potbelly stove in the corner, and beside it a stack of firewood that some kind soul had left behind. Eleanor's hands were shaking so badly that she could barely strike a match, but on the third try she got a flame and managed to light the kindling she had stuffed into the stove. The cowboy came in a moment later, stamping snow off his boots and pulling the door shut behind him against the howling wind. He yanked down his bandana and pushed back his hat, and Eleanor got her first clear look at him. He was young, probably no more than 25, with a lean, weathered face and a strong jaw darkened by several days' worth of stubble. His hair was dark brown, almost black, and curled slightly where it brushed the collar of his coat. He was handsome, in a rugged, unsettling way that made Eleanor's stomach do an unexpected flip. "I am James McKenna," he said, stripping off his gloves and moving to the stove to warm his hands. "I work for the Double R Ranch about 10 miles south of here." "Eleanor Webb," she replied, her voice still shaky from the cold. "I was trying to reach Leadville." James looked at her with something like disbelief. "In this weather? That is another 20 miles and the pass will be closed by now." Eleanor felt tears prick at her eyes, but she blinked them back furiously. She would not cry in front of this stranger, no matter how desperate her situation. "My sister is ill. I promised I would be there." James's expression softened slightly. "I am sorry to hear that. But you would not have done her any good if you froze to death trying to reach her. We will wait out the storm here, and then I will help you get to Leadville." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She moved closer to the stove, holding her hands out to the growing warmth. The fire was catching now, and the small cabin was beginning to lose some of its bone-deep chill. James rummaged through the supplies stored in the shack and came up with a battered coffee pot, some grounds, and a few tins of beans and hardtack. "Not much of a feast, but it will keep us going," he said, setting the coffee pot on top of the stove to heat. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the storm rage outside. Eleanor studied James from the corner of her eye, taking in the confident way he moved, the competence with which he handled even the simplest tasks. He was clearly a man who was comfortable in his own skin, who knew how to survive in this harsh land. There was something deeply attractive about that, Eleanor realized, and she felt her cheeks heat with a blush that had nothing to do with the fire. "How long have you worked for the Double R?" she asked, more to break the silence than out of genuine curiosity. 5 years, James replied, pouring coffee into 2 tin cups and handing one to her. "Since I was 20. I came out from Missouri looking for work, and the foreman took a chance on me. Been there ever since." Eleanor sipped the coffee, which was strong and bitter but blessedly hot. "Do you like it? The work, I mean." James considered the question, his eyes distant. "It is hard. The winters are brutal. The summers are not much better, and the pay is barely enough to keep body and soul together. But there is something about this country that gets into your blood. The mountains, the open sky, the sense that you are part of something bigger than yourself. I cannot imagine living anywhere else now." Eleanor understood what he meant. She had grown up in St. Louis in a comfortable house with servants and fine things, but when she had come west 2 years ago to help her sister and her husband start their new life in Leadville, she had felt that same pull. There was a wildness here, a sense of possibility that simply did not exist in the civilized cities of the East. It was dangerous and difficult, but it was also exhilarating. They ate their meager meal in companionable silence, and then James checked the door and the single window to make sure they were secure against the storm. The wind was howling with even greater fury now, and Eleanor could hear the snow piling up against the walls of the cabin. She moved to the window and peered out, but all she could see was a solid wall of white. "I have never seen it snow like this," she whispered. James came to stand beside her, and Eleanor was acutely aware of his presence, of the warmth radiating from his body. "This is a bad one," he agreed. "Worst I have seen in 5 years. We are lucky we made it here when we did." As if to underscore his words, there was a tremendous crack from outside, and the cabin shook. Eleanor gasped and grabbed James's arm instinctively. He put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Just a tree branch coming down," he said calmly. "The cabin is solid. We will be fine." But as the hours passed and the storm continued to rage, Eleanor began to wonder if they really would be fine. The temperature inside the cabin was dropping despite the fire in the stove, and she could see frost forming on the inside of the walls. James fed more wood into the stove, but the wind was sucking the heat right out through the cracks in the walls and the gaps around the door and window. "We need to seal those gaps," James said, echoing Eleanor's thoughts. He looked around the cabin, assessing their options. Do you have any extra clothing in your bags? Eleanor shook her head. My horse had my bags. All I have is what I'm wearing. James cursed again, then began stripping the threadbare blankets from the cabin's single bunk. He stuffed them into the gaps around the door and window, but Eleanor could still feel the cold air seeping in. It was not enough. The storm was too powerful, the cold too intense. And then, with a sinking feeling in her stomach, Eleanor heard a new sound, a low, ominous creaking that seemed to come from all around them. James heard it too, and his expression turned grim. What is that? Eleanor asked, though she had a terrible suspicion she already knew. Snow, James said shortly. It is piling up against the walls. If it gets too heavy, it could collapse the cabin. Eleanor felt panic rising in her throat. What do we do? James was already moving, grabbing his coat and gloves. We dig. We have to keep the snow from building up too much on any one side, especially around the door. If we get buried in here, we will suffocate long before we freeze. Eleanor did not hesitate. She pulled on her own coat and gloves, which had been drying by the fire, and followed James to the door. He had to put his shoulder to it to force it open against the weight of the snow that had accumulated, and when he finally got it clear, Eleanor saw with horror that the snow was already waist-deep and still falling at an alarming rate. James grabbed a shovel that had been leaning against the wall of the cabin and thrust it into Eleanor's hands. Start digging on this side. I will take the other. We need to create a trench all the way around the cabin to give the snow somewhere to go besides against the walls. Eleanor nodded and set to work. The snow was heavy and wet, and her muscles screamed in protest as she lifted shovelful after shovelful and threw it as far from the cabin as she could. The wind tried to tear the shovel from her hands, and the snow stung her face like needles. Within minutes, her arms were aching and she was breathing hard, but she did not stop. She could not stop. Their lives depended on it. James worked on the opposite side of the cabin, and Eleanor could hear the rhythmic sound of his shovel biting into the snow even over the howl of the wind. She dug with grim determination, creating a narrow trench that ran along the wall of the cabin, but even as she worked, she could see the snow filling in behind her, erasing her progress almost as quickly as she made it. She did not know how long they worked. Time seemed to lose all meaning in the endless white chaos of the storm. Her arms felt like lead and her back was on fire, but she kept digging. She thought about her sister waiting for her in Leadville, and that gave her the strength to lift the shovel one more time, and then again. Finally, James appeared around the corner of the cabin, his face red and raw from the cold. He took one look at Eleanor and shook his head. Inside, he shouted over the wind, we need to warm up before we freeze out here. Eleanor did not argue. She followed him back into the cabin, and James forced the door shut behind them. They both collapsed near the stove, gasping for breath. Eleanor's hands were shaking so badly that she could barely unfasten her coat, and James had to help her. His own hands were steadier, but she could see the exhaustion in his eyes. We cannot keep this up all night, Eleanor said when she finally found her voice. We will wear ourselves out. We do not have a choice, James replied grimly. He added more wood to the fire, but Eleanor could see that their supply was dwindling. They would run out long before the storm ended. If we stop digging, we will be buried, and if we are buried, we die. Eleanor knew he was right, but the thought of going back out into that nightmare made her want to weep. Instead, she forced herself to her feet. Then we keep digging. But we work together this time. It will go faster, and we can keep each other from giving up. James looked at her with something like respect in his eyes. You are tougher than you look, Eleanor Webb. I have had to be, Eleanor replied simply. They rested for a few more minutes, just long enough to stop shivering, and then they went back out into the storm. This time they worked side by side, taking turns with the single shovel. When one of them was digging, the other would use their hands or a piece of broken board to push the snow away from the cabin. It was brutal, exhausting work, but Eleanor found a strange kind of comfort in James's presence beside her. They did not speak much. There was no breath to spare for conversation, but they developed a rhythm, a silent understanding of what needed to be done. Hours passed. The storm showed no sign of letting up. Eleanor's world narrowed to the small circle of light from the cabin window, the weight of the shovel in her hands, and the solid, reassuring presence of James working beside her. Her muscles screamed, her lungs burned, and her face felt like it had been scraped raw. But she did not stop. At some point she became aware that James was watching her, even as he shoveled. When she glanced at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her heart skip a beat. It was not pity, and it was not merely respect. It was something warmer, something that made her feel seen in a way she had never experienced before. "You are remarkable," James said quietly, and Eleanor felt a flush of warmth that had nothing to do with the exertion. "I'm just doing what needs to be done," she replied, but her voice was softer than she intended. "Most women would have given up by now," James said. "Hell, most men would have given up. But you just keep going." Eleanor shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. "What else would I do? Sit inside and wait to die?" "Some people would," James said. He reached out and brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch gentle despite his rough, work-hardened hands. "You are something special, Eleanor." Eleanor felt her breath catch in her throat. There was something in the way he was looking at her, something that made the cold and the storm and the danger fade into the background. For a moment they just stood there, snow swirling around them, and Eleanor felt a connection that was deeper and more profound than anything she had ever experienced. Then James cleared his throat and turned back to his shoveling, and the moment passed, but it did not disappear entirely. It hung in the air between them, a promise of something that neither of them was quite ready to name. They worked through the night, taking brief breaks to warm themselves by the fire and drink melted snow when their canteen ran dry. The storm raged on, relentless and merciless, but Eleanor and James dug with equal determination. They were fighting for their lives, and they both knew it. But more than that, they were fighting together, and that made all the difference. As the hours stretched on, Eleanor found herself telling James about her life, about growing up in St. Louis, about her decision to come west to help her sister. James, in turn, told her about his own childhood in Missouri, about the farm his family had lost to debt, about his decision to come to Colorado to make a new start. They talked about their dreams and their fears, about the people they had loved and lost, about the future they hoped to build in this wild, unforgiving land. And as they talked, Eleanor realized that she was falling in love with James McKenna. It was not the slow, comfortable affection she had always imagined love would be. It was something fiercer and more urgent, something forged in the crucible of survival and hardship. It was the knowledge that this man would stand beside her through the worst that life could throw at them, that he would dig through a snowstorm all night to keep them both alive, that he would never give up and never let her give up either. Sometime in the darkest hours before dawn, they finally stopped to rest. They were both swaying on their feet, almost too exhausted to make it back into the cabin. James had to half carry Eleanor the last few steps, and they collapsed together on the floor near the stove. The fire had burned down to embers, and there were only a few pieces of wood left, but James carefully added them to the fire and coaxed it back to life. Eleanor was shaking all over, not just from the cold, but from the sheer effort of what they had just endured. James pulled the thin blankets over them both and wrapped his arms around her, sharing his warmth. Eleanor should have been scandalized, should have pulled away and insisted on propriety, but she could not bring herself to care. She was too cold, too tired, and too grateful for the solid comfort of his embrace. "We are going to make it," James whispered into her hair. "The storm has to break soon. We just have to hold on a little longer." Eleanor nodded against his chest, but she was not sure she believed him. She had never been so tired in her entire life. Every part of her body hurt, and the thought of going back out into that storm was almost unbearable. But she would do it, she knew. She would do it, because James was beside her, and together they were stronger than either of them could be alone. They dozed fitfully, waking every hour or so to check the storm and add more snow to the trenches they had dug. Each time was harder than the last, and each time Eleanor was not sure she would have the strength to get back up. But James was always there, pulling her to her feet, handing her the shovel, working beside her with the same grim determination that kept her going. Finally, as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the storm clouds, Eleanor realized that the wind was dying down. The snow was still falling, but not with the same savage intensity. She looked at James, hardly daring to hope, and saw the same realization dawning in his eyes. "It is ending," he said, and his voice was rough with exhaustion and relief. They made one final circuit around the cabin, clearing away the last of the snow that had piled up during the night. The trenches they had dug were deep and wide, and Eleanor marveled that they had accomplished so much. The snowdrifts around the cabin were taller than she was, massive walls of white that would have crushed the cabin if they had not worked so hard to keep them at bay. When they finally stumbled back inside, the sun was breaking through the clouds, sending shafts of golden light across the snow-covered landscape. It was breathtakingly beautiful, and Eleanor felt tears running down her cheeks. They had survived. Against all odds, they had survived the worst storm she had ever seen, and they had done it together. James saw her tears and gently wiped them away with his thumb. "Do not cry," he said softly. "We made it. You made it." "I could not have done it without you," Eleanor whispered. "And I could not have done it without you," James replied. He cupped her face in his hands, his eyes searching hers. "Eleanor, I know this is not the time or the place, and I know we have only known each other for one night, but I have never met anyone like you. You are brave and strong and beautiful, and I would very much like the chance to know you better, to court you properly, if you will let me." Eleanor's heart soared. She had been hoping he would say something like this, but she had not dared to believe it would actually happen. "I would like that very much," she said. And then James was kissing her, and it was everything she had ever dreamed a kiss could be. They stayed in the line shack for the rest of the day, resting and recovering from their ordeal. James's horse had weathered the storm well in the lean-to, and by evening the snow had stopped completely. The world outside was transformed into a glittering wonderland, beautiful and deadly in equal measure. The next morning they set out for Leadville. James insisted on taking Eleanor all the way to her sister's house, and Eleanor was grateful beyond words. The journey took 2 days, picking their way carefully through the deep snow, but eventually they arrived at the small house on the edge of town where Eleanor's sister lived with her husband. Eleanor's sister Margaret was indeed ill, but not as seriously as Eleanor had feared. She had been suffering from pneumonia, but the worst had passed and she was on the mend. Margaret was overjoyed to see Eleanor, and she was equally delighted when Eleanor introduced James and explained what had happened during the storm. "You dug through a blizzard all night?" Margaret exclaimed, her eyes wide. "Eleanor, you could have died." "We would have died if we had not dug," Eleanor replied simply. She looked at James, who was standing awkwardly in the corner of the room, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "James saved my life." "You saved your own life," James said quietly. "I just helped." Margaret's husband Thomas, a burly miner with a kind face, clapped James on the shoulder. "Sounds to me like you both saved each other. You're welcome to stay here as long as you need, McKenna. Any friend of Eleanor's is a friend of ours." James stayed for 3 days, helping Thomas with repairs around the house and getting to know Eleanor's family. Eleanor spent as much time with him as she could, and with each passing hour she fell more deeply in love with him. He was kind and patient, with a quiet strength that made her feel safe. He listened when she talked, really listened, and he made her laugh with his dry humor and his stories about life on the ranch. On the 3rd evening, James asked Eleanor to take a walk with him. They bundled up against the cold and walked through the snowy streets of Leadville, their breath forming clouds in the frosty air. James took Eleanor's hand, and she laced her fingers through his, marveling at how right it felt. "I have to go back to the Double R tomorrow," James said finally. The foreman will be wondering where I am, and there is work that needs doing. But I do not want to leave you, Eleanor, not now that I have found you." Eleanor's heart sank. She had known this moment was coming, but she had been dreading it. "I do not want you to leave either," she admitted. James stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Then come with me. Not right away. I know you need to stay with your sister until she is fully recovered. But when she is well again, come to the ranch. I will speak to the foreman, see if there is work for you in the ranch house. Mrs. Reynolds, the foreman's wife, is always complaining that she needs help with the cooking and the cleaning. And while you are there, I can court you properly. I can take you to dances and church socials, and I can show you off to everyone and make them all jealous that you chose me." Eleanor laughed through the tears that were suddenly streaming down her face. "I would love that," she said. "I would love all of that." James pulled her into his arms and kissed her, right there in the middle of the street, and Eleanor did not care who saw them. She was in love, truly and completely, and she had never been happier in her entire life. James left the next morning, but not before extracting a promise from Eleanor that she would come to the Double R as soon as Margaret was well enough. Eleanor spent the next 6 weeks helping her sister recover, nursing her back to health and taking care of the house while Thomas worked his claim. Margaret improved steadily, and by the end of February, she was almost back to her old self. "You should go to him," Margaret said one evening as they sat by the fire mending clothes. "I can see how much you miss him, Eleanor. And I am well enough now that I do not need you hovering over me like a mother hen." Eleanor hesitated. "Are you sure? I do not want to leave you if you still need me." "I am sure," Margaret said firmly. "Thomas is here, and I am feeling stronger every day. Besides, it is about time you thought about your own happiness for a change. You have spent the last 2 years taking care of everyone else. It is your turn now." So in early March, Eleanor packed her bags and set out for the Double R Ranch. James had sent her a letter with detailed directions, and Thomas arranged for her to ride with a supply wagon that was heading in that direction. The journey took 3 days, but Eleanor did not mind. She was too excited, too full of anticipation, to care about the discomfort of the rough roads and the cold nights camping under the stars. When the wagon finally pulled up to the main house of the Double R Ranch, Eleanor's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst from her chest. The ranch was bigger than she had imagined, with a large main house, several outbuildings and corrals filled with horses and cattle. It was beautiful in a stark, windswept way, with the snow-capped peaks of the Rockies rising in the distance, and then James was there, running out of the barn with a huge grin on his face. He swept Eleanor up into his arms and spun her around, and Eleanor laughed with pure joy. He set her down gently and kissed her, a long, sweet kiss that made her forget everything else. "You came," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "I was afraid you might change your mind." "Never," Eleanor said fiercely. "I would never change my mind about you, James McKenna." Mrs. Reynolds, the foreman's wife, turned out to be a plump, cheerful woman who took to Eleanor immediately. She put Eleanor to work in the ranch house, helping with the cooking and the cleaning, and the endless tasks that came with running a large household. The work was hard, but Eleanor did not mind. She was close to James, and that was all that mattered. James courted her with old-fashioned determination. He took her on long rides through the mountains, showing her the places he loved best. He brought her wildflowers in the spring and taught her how to rope a calf. He held her hand during church services and danced with her at the local socials, and he made it clear to everyone that Eleanor Webb was his girl and that he intended to marry her as soon as she would have him. Eleanor had never been so happy. She loved the ranch, loved the hard work, and the sense of purpose it gave her. She loved the wide open spaces and the clean mountain air. But most of all, she loved James. She loved the way he looked at her, like she was the most precious thing in the world. She loved his quiet strength and his gentle humor. She loved the way he made her feel safe and cherished and understood. In June, on a warm evening when the meadows were filled with wildflowers and the air smelled of pine and sage, James took Eleanor for a ride up to a high mountain meadow. He spread a blanket on the grass, and they sat together watching the sun set over the peaks, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson and purple. "Eleanor," James said, taking her hand, "I have been waiting for the right moment to ask you this, and I do not think there will ever be a more perfect moment than this one. You are the bravest, strongest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. You dug through a blizzard with me all night, and you never once complained or gave up. You have made me happier than I ever thought I could be, and I want to spend the rest of my life making you just as happy. Will you marry me?" Eleanor felt tears of joy streaming down her face. "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "Yes, James, I will marry you. 1,000 times yes." James pulled out a simple gold band that he had been saving for months to buy, and he slipped it onto Eleanor's finger. It was not fancy, but to Eleanor it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. James kissed her then, and Eleanor kissed him back with all the love and passion in her heart. They were married in August in the small church in the town nearest to the ranch. Margaret and Thomas made the journey to attend, along with the foreman and Mrs. Reynolds and most of the ranch hands. It was a simple ceremony, but it was filled with love and joy and the promise of a future together. James and Eleanor built a small house on the ranch, just a few hundred yards from the main house. It was nothing fancy, just 3 rooms and a small porch, but to Eleanor it was a palace. They filled it with simple furniture that James built with his own hands, and Eleanor made curtains and quilts to brighten the rooms. It was their home, the first real home Eleanor had ever had that was truly hers. Their first year of marriage was not easy. The ranch work was relentless, and there were times when Eleanor was so tired she could barely stand, but she and James faced every challenge together, just as they had faced that terrible blizzard. They supported each other, encouraged each other, and loved each other through the hard times and the good. In the spring of 1884, Eleanor discovered she was expecting their first child. James was overjoyed, and he became even more protective of Eleanor, insisting that she not work too hard and that she rest whenever she could. Eleanor found his concern both touching and slightly exasperating, but she loved him all the more for it. Their son was born in November, a healthy, squalling baby boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's green eyes. They named him Thomas, after Eleanor's brother-in-law, and James cried when he held his son for the first time. Eleanor watched her husband cradle their baby with such tenderness and love, and she knew that she had made the right choice in marrying him. Over the years that followed, James and Eleanor built a life together that was rich with love and purpose. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Margaret after Eleanor's sister, and another son they named Samuel. The little house became filled with laughter and noise, and the beautiful chaos of a growing family. James eventually became the foreman of the Double R Ranch when the old foreman retired, and Eleanor became known throughout the area for her kindness and her skill with healing herbs. People would come from miles around seeking her help when they were sick or injured, and Eleanor never turned anyone away. But no matter how busy their lives became, James and Eleanor always made time for each other. They would take long walks together in the evenings, talking about their day and making plans for the future. They would sit together on the porch after the children were in bed, watching the stars come out and remembering that terrible, wonderful night when they had dug through a blizzard together and found each other. "Do you ever regret it?" James asked one evening, many years after that fateful storm. "Coming out here, marrying a cowboy, living this hard life?" Eleanor looked at her husband, at the gray that was beginning to streak his dark hair, at the lines that years of sun and wind had etched into his face. She thought about their children, grown now and making their own way in the world. She thought about the life they had built together, the love they had shared, the challenges they had overcome. "Never," she said, taking his hand, "not for a single moment. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, James McKenna. That storm brought us together, and I thank God for it every day." James smiled and pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I love you, Eleanor McKenna. I have loved you since the moment I saw you standing in that snowstorm, refusing to give up, and I will love you until the day I die and beyond." "And I love you," Eleanor whispered, "always and forever." They sat together in the gathering darkness, two people who had found each other in the midst of a terrible storm and had built a love that was as enduring as the mountains themselves. The snowdrift had been too deep to tunnel through alone, but together they had dug their way to safety and to each other. And that made all the difference. Years turned into decades, and James and Eleanor grew old together on the ranch they loved. Their children had children of their own, and the little house that James had built was filled with grandchildren who loved to hear the story of how their grandparents had met during the great blizzard of 1882. Eleanor would tell them about digging through the snow all night, about how their grandfather had never given up, about how they had fought for their lives and found love in the process. James would add his own embellishments, making Eleanor laugh with his exaggerations about how brave she had been, how she had wielded that shovel like a warrior queen. The grandchildren would listen with wide eyes, hardly able to believe that their gentle grandmother had survived such an ordeal. When James finally passed away in 1920, at the age of 63, Eleanor was heartbroken. But she took comfort in the fact that they had been given so many wonderful years together, that they had built a family and a life that was rich with love and meaning. She lived for another 10 years, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and when she finally closed her eyes for the last time, she was smiling, thinking of James and the night they had dug through a blizzard together. Their story became a legend in that part of Colorado, a testament to the power of love and determination and the unbreakable bond that can form between two people when they face the worst that life can throw at them and refuse to surrender. The little house they had built still stood on the Double R Ranch, now occupied by their grandson and his family, and the story of Eleanor and James was passed down through the generations, a reminder that true love can be found in the most unexpected places and that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with a storm.